She thought walking home alone was dangerous, but nothing could prepare her for the man hiding in the shadows. He was ruthless, untouchable, a billionaire feared by everyone, except her one night, one kidnapping, and everything she knew about fear, power, and love would change forever. And by morning, nothing would ever be the same. Hey there, before we dive in, tell me, where are you listening from today? I'd love to know. Also, don't forget to rate my stories out of 10 in the comments. I really want to hear your thoughts. And one small request, please don't skip through the story, stay with me till the end, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss an exciting tale. All right, now, let's dive into the story. The rain fell in relentless sheets over the streets of New Haven, drumming against the slick asphalt in a rhythm that echoed Selena's own heartbeat, a mixture of weariness from her long shift and the faint thrill of moving through a city that could turn dangerous in the blink of an eye. Her heels clicked sharply against the wet pavement, a deliberate punctuation of her steps that carried the poise of someone who had learned to command her space, not just navigate it. And though the neon lights of convenience stores and coffee shops blurred in the rain's reflection, Selena's eyes remained focused on the path ahead, alert yet calm, every instinct sharpened by years of knowing that the world did not often bow to women who walked alone at night. Shadows moved along the alleyways, but she had grown accustomed to them, having faced the unsavory and the reckless countless times. She did not flinch. She did not avert her gaze. She merely kept walking, letting the rhythm of her heels echo a quiet defiance that drew attention without her seeking it. And attention came, though not in a form she could anticipate. Damien Cross watched from the darkness, his figure partially obscured beneath a tailored black coat, his presence like an immovable shadow against the neon glow. Whispers of his empire had reached every corner of the city, painting him as a man to fear, a man who crushed resistance without a second thought. Yet tonight, as he observed Selena, something unfamiliar stirred within him. Curiosity, interest, a fascination that he had never allowed to take root in decades of commanding people and controlling outcomes. She was unaware, as she approached the dimly lit street corner near her apartment, that she had already captured the attention of the city's most feared man, not through submission or charm, but through her sheer refusal to be intimidated, her silent declaration that she would not bow, even to forces invisible and dangerous. It was that defiance that drew the first challenge, a figure stepping out from a side street, hood pulled low, an unmistakable sneer curling across his face as he blocked her path, arms folded like a barricade, attempting to assert dominance through presence alone. "Go in somewhere, sweetheart," the thug hissed, the threat thinly veiled but unmistakable, the voice carrying a weight of menace trained to prey on fear. Selena stopped, assessing him with a sharp, calculating glance, her dark brown eyes locking with his, unwavering and unyielding, a spark of fire that told him she did not negotiate with intimidation. "Back off, or you'll regret it," she said calmly, her voice carrying the sort of quiet power that made him falter for just a heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, Damien felt it, that unusual tension that made him lean forward, unseen, his fingers brushing against the edges of the polished mahogany railing behind which he had been hidden. The thug's eyes flickered, uncertainty surfacing as Selena's gaze did not waver, and though he tried to regain control, the words he had prepared faltered, replaced by a shaky laugh that betrayed his nerves. "You think you're tough," he muttered, stepping forward anyway. But even as he lunged, Selena was ready, sidestepping with practiced ease, her movements fluid, elegant and precise, a dangerous beauty who seemed to balance grace and strength effortlessly. Damien's chest tightened, not with anger, but with something he had rarely felt: admiration. The way she moved, the way she faced danger without flinching, ignited a spark inside him, a fascination that threatened to distract him from the rules he had long imposed on himself. He had never seen a woman command respect without demanding it. And tonight, watching Selena, he realized that power could take forms he had underestimated, forms that did not involve wealth or fear, but sheer presence and unwavering courage. The thug cursed under his breath, frustrated, and Selina's lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile, one that spoke of amusement at his ineptitude, and as she moved past him, continuing toward her apartment, Damien's mind raced, imagining what it would mean to have someone like her within his reach, to unravel the enigma she presented without resorting to his usual dominance. But the night was far from over. As Selina turned the corner onto the street leading directly to her building, the soft glow of her apartment's exterior light welcoming her after the stormy walk, a black luxury SUV appeared behind her, tires splashing puddles as the vehicle came to a screeching halt, engine growling like a predator closing in on its prey. Selina's senses, honed by years of independent survival, tingled with instinctive alarm. Before she could react fully, strong hands reached out from the shadows, grabbing her with an inescapable grip that dragged her into the unknown. Panic surged, but she did not scream immediately, calculating her options, assessing the weight, the force, the control of whoever dared touch her. Darkness engulfed her, the city lights fading as the SUV's door closed over her, sealing her fate, or so it seemed. Inside, Damien's presence loomed, a figure of control and secrecy, and yet, as he observed her initial resistance, a thrill ran through him, a recognition that this would not be a simple capture, a simple lesson, a simple conquest. Selina struggled briefly, testing the strength of her captor, her dark eyes flashing with defiance, but even in that moment, the faintest curve of her lips betrayed something almost imperceptible, amusement at the audacity of the situation, or perhaps anticipation of the challenge that lay ahead. Damien, unseen but intimately aware of her reactions, felt the pulse of life, the spark of spirit that made her dangerous in ways beyond physicality, and the corners of his mouth curled in something between intrigue and admiration. As the SUV accelerated, tires cutting through the rain-soaked streets, Selina's mind raced. Plans, escape routes, assessment of who could have orchestrated such a bold move. But with each moment, the darkness pressed closer, and Damien's calculated presence was felt in every shift of the vehicle, every subtle hint that he was in control, yet observing, measuring, learning the nuances of a woman who refused to be diminished. And in that forced quiet, amid the roar of the engine and the steady downpour outside, Selina's thoughts darted from practical survival to the strange, unsettling pull she felt toward the man whose hands had captured her, whose aura filled the space despite his absence. And she realized, even in that moment, that her challenge had only just begun, that the world she knew had shifted under her feet, and that every instinct would be tested in ways she could not yet comprehend. The SUV took a turn sharply, and the sudden jolt made her gasp, her mind registering the power, the intent, the calculated precision with which she had been taken. And as she struggled again, Damien's voice finally broke through the tension, smooth, controlled, almost teasing, yet carrying an edge of command that made her stop mid-struggle. "Lesson number 1, he said softly, is that not everyone who seems invisible is powerless." Selina's pulse surged, anger and caution warring with the strange curiosity that flickered in her chest, the way her mind insisted on analyzing the man behind the act rather than succumbing to immediate fear. She opened her mouth to respond, but Damien's eyes, sharp and discerning, even in the dim light of the SUV, held her silence, measured, studying, calculating, as if each heartbeat, each breath, was part of an intricate game she had been unwillingly drawn into. The SUV moved faster, rain slapping the windows, windshield wipers slicing through the night's reflection, each splash of water outside a mirror of the tension inside, each droplet a countdown toward a confrontation she had not sought but could not escape. Selina's thoughts flicked to the outside world, neighbors, passers-by, the city that never slept, but the isolation of the vehicle, the controlled environment, made it clear that for the moment she was entirely in the hands of someone whose reputation preceded him, a man whose presence carried danger, power, and a magnetic draw she could neither deny nor fully understand. And as the city lights blurred past, Damien allowed himself a moment of rare honesty, admitting to a thought he had not entertained in years. This woman, this intruder into his carefully controlled life, would not be tamed easily, and in fact the very challenge she presented stirred a dark, thrilling anticipation that made the thrill of capture feel almost secondary to the storm of curiosity and desire that now burned in him. Selina, meanwhile, braced herself, aware that the night would demand every ounce of courage, wit, and resilience she possessed. And even as fear brushed against the edges of her resolve, she felt the spark of defiance flare, a quiet signal that she would not yield silently, that her spirit, as strong as the rain beating down on the streets she had just walked, would be the first frontier Damien would struggle to conquer, and the first line in a game whose rules neither of them had yet fully understood, and the first chapter of a story neither could yet imagine. Selina's eyes fluttered open to a room bathed in a strange mixture of gold and shadows. The sunlight filtered through heavy velvet curtains that created an almost dreamlike haze, the air rich with the subtle scent of expensive cologne, a scent that carried authority and danger in equal measure, making her stomach tighten even as her mind raced to comprehend where she was and why. The realization settling in that this was no ordinary confinement, no cold cell or sterile apartment that one might expect from a typical kidnapper, but rather a space drenched in luxury, every detail meticulously chosen, from the thick, plush carpets that muted the slightest sound to the gleaming surfaces that reflected a world she had never truly been invited into, a world of power, wealth, and influence that had always existed on the other side of glass and velvet ropes, and now suddenly it surrounded her, oppressive and intoxicating, as if daring her to resist while simultaneously tempting her with the allure of absolute control, a duality she found herself both disliking and oddly compelled by. Damien stood in the doorway, tall and imposing, even in the softened morning light, the sharp angles of his face, usually etched with authority and dominance, now softened by a flicker of amusement that betrayed the slightest vulnerability, a glimpse of the man behind the legend, the man whose reputation for ruthlessness stretched across the city, yet whose expression in this moment suggested something more complex, something that only she, with her fearless gaze, could provoke. And when his voice finally broke the silence, smooth, measured, and edged with undeniable control, it carried the weight of someone accustomed to having every move obeyed, every whim anticipated. Yet there was an almost imperceptible curiosity hidden beneath the tone. "Lesson number 1, he said, stepping fully into the room, each movement precise, deliberate, commanding even in casual posture. Never underestimate someone like me." Selina lifted her chin, shoulders squared, the rhythm of her heartbeat steady, despite the adrenaline still coursing from the night's events, and met his gaze with the same unwavering defiance that had caused thugs to hesitate on wet city streets. Her voice calm, resonant, carrying the subtle undertone of someone who had learned early in life that fear could not be allowed to dominate her. "Lesson number 1 for you," she replied evenly, the words slicing through the opulent air like a knife. "Never think everyone is afraid of you." Damien's jaw tightened at her audacity, the corners of his eyes narrowing, a flicker of surprise crossing his usually unreadable expression, because no one had ever spoken to him this way. Least of all, someone he had forcibly brought into his domain, someone whose very existence challenged his carefully constructed authority. And yet, in that very challenge, something stirred in him that he neither expected nor wanted to confront. A pull, a fascination, a dangerous curiosity that made it impossible to look away from her fiery eyes, eyes that were not merely defiant, but filled with intelligence, wit, and an almost magnetic confidence that drew him in, despite the years he had spent perfecting control, despite the empires he had built, and the fear he had cultivated. And in that room, in that golden shadow, Damien felt the first crack of something he had never allowed himself to feel, genuine interest that did not bow to power or manipulation, interest that simply existed, raw and unfiltered. Selina's gaze swept the room, noting the vastness, the opulence, the deliberate silence that hinted at unseen cameras, unseen security, measures taken not merely for protection but for dominance. A carefully curated environment meant to unsettle and control. And yet, she found herself almost studying it with detached curiosity, noting the luxurious textiles, the artwork that whispered wealth, the faint hum of hidden technology, every detail meticulously placed to remind her that she was in someone else's world entirely, and every instinct she had screamed that she should panic, that she should scream, that she should fight in ways she had never fought before, and yet her mind remained sharp, her body alert, and her heart, though racing, refused to surrender. A defiance that made Damien's fascination deepen because it was rare, almost extinct in the people he encountered, to find a spirit that matched the intensity of his own, a fire that would not be extinguished by threats, money, or manipulation. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as Damien maintained his presence in the doorway, watching her with a predatory patience, observing the subtle ways she moved, how she tested boundaries, how she seemed both aware of his attention and indifferent to it, a contradiction that both enraged and intrigued him. As she walked the room slowly, almost measuring each step, fingers grazing the thick carpet, eyes flicking to the corners as if assessing every potential threat, every weakness, every point of control, and with each passing moment, Damien realized that this was not a woman who could be subdued with force, that the usual tools he wielded, fear, intimidation, wealth, were insufficient against someone like Selina, and the realization was both maddening and exhilarating, because for the first time in years he faced a challenge that he did not want to overcome immediately, a challenge that promised a game of wits, endurance, and something far more dangerous: connection. As evening fell, the soft glow of hidden lights bathed the room in warm amber hues, casting long shadows that seemed to dance along the velvet curtains and gold-trimmed walls, and Selina, despite the lavish surroundings, could feel the tension coiling in the air, thick and unspoken, the kind of tension that spoke of invisible battles and silent negotiations, the kind of tension that suggested that while her body was confined, her mind remained free, and Damien, though controlling every element of the environment, could not control the reactions he felt, the quickened pulse, the subtle catch of breath when she turned her gaze toward him, the undeniable awareness that she existed within his sphere and yet remained untouchable in her spirit. Night deepened, and silence enveloped the mansion like a living thing, broken only by the occasional soft click of the clock, the distant hum of the city beyond the walls, and the whisper of wind against the heavy curtains, carrying with it the scent of rain, a reminder of the streets she had walked alone, a reminder of freedom, danger, and choice. And as Damien stood outside her door later, unseen but acutely aware of her presence, he listened to the steady rhythm of her breathing, a sound that somehow betrayed both calm and vigilance, a sound that was steady enough to suggest control yet charged with life, and in that listening he found himself battling instincts he had long suppressed, instincts that demanded he intervene, that demanded he close the space between them, that demanded he bend the rules of detachment he had so meticulously constructed. And in that moment, Damien realized with startling clarity that he was already drawn in, that his obsession, subtle and consuming, had begun, and that the night ahead would not be governed by logic, rules, or control, but by the unpredictable, intoxicating force of Selina's presence, her courage, and the impossible tension that crackled invisibly between them. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint rustle behind the door, every shadow cast by the lamp seemed amplified in his perception, each minor sound a signal, a question, a potential threat or invitation, and Damien, standing in the hall, felt the weight of anticipation pressing against him, the thrill of the unknown, the thrill of being challenged in ways that were unfamiliar yet exhilarating, because here was a woman who would not cower, a woman who would not yield, and a woman who, whether he admitted it or not, had already begun to dominate his thoughts, infiltrating his carefully guarded mind in ways that nothing and no one had ever managed before. And the realization made his chest tighten, his mind race, and his carefully maintained composure falter in tiny, almost imperceptible ways. Each heartbeat a reminder that control was slipping, and that the lesson he intended to impart might already be reversed, because Selina, in her fearless, commanding way, was already teaching him lessons about desire, fascination, and vulnerability that he had long denied himself. The mansion, once a place of absolute authority, became a labyrinth of possibility, each hallway and corridor echoing with silent questions, each shadow a potential threat or secret. And as Damien retreated into the corners of the hall, listening, watching, and calculating, he understood that the game had only begun, that this night, this encounter, would stretch far beyond rules and conventions into a realm where attraction, defiance, and unspoken tension ruled, and every step, every breath, every glance between them carried the potential to ignite consequences neither could yet predict, consequences that would unravel control, awaken desire, and push them both into uncharted, dangerous, and exhilarating territory, a territory where the line between captor and captivated blurred with every passing moment. And Selina, oblivious to the full scope of the power she held over him, continued to navigate the room with quiet dignity, unaware that each movement, each subtle act of defiance, each assertion of independence was setting the stage for a storm that would change both their lives irrevocably, a storm that Damien, despite every instinct of dominance and control, was powerless to resist. And as the clock ticked toward midnight, the silence of the mansion became charged, alive, electric with anticipation, and the unspoken promise lingered in the golden shadows. That the night was far from over, that lessons were being written in ways neither fully understood, and that every breath, every glance, every heartbeat would bring them closer to a collision of will, desire, and destiny that neither could ignore. The golden shadows of the mansion's hallways stretched long and deep as Selina moved with a fluid confidence that both challenged and intrigued Damien, her steps deliberate yet seemingly effortless, her presence commanding attention without demanding it, a subtle defiance wrapped in elegance and grace. And though he had watched her for hours, studied every micro-expression, and catalogued every reaction, he found himself unsettled, unprepared for the way her laughter echoed lightly down the corridors, a sound that seemed to flout the rules he had imposed, a sound that danced around authority and slid through control like a blade, carving into the rigid walls he had built over decades to protect himself from anyone daring enough to approach too closely. She wandered freely, fingers brushing against the polished surfaces of tables and shelves, her gaze flicking over the art, the rare artifacts, the trophies of power and influence that were meant to remind intruders of their place. Yet her eyes betrayed curiosity and amusement rather than fear, and in that Damien felt a stirring deep in his chest, a fire that he could neither name nor suppress, a spark that seemed to burn brighter with every step she took in the space he had meticulously curated to dominate all who entered. "Why do you run like this?" she asked one evening, her voice soft yet daring, threading through the dimly lit corridor with the precision of someone unafraid to confront a man who had never been challenged so directly, and her words, so deceptively simple, struck Damien with a force that left him momentarily speechless, because for the first time in his life, someone looked beyond the facade, beyond the empire of fear he had built, and sought the man within, the man who hid behind control, secrecy, and silence. The man who rarely, if ever, let anyone truly in. "Why not let someone in?" she added, her eyes steady, her gaze unflinching. And in that instant, Damien realized that the rules he had lived by, rules of dominance, rules of isolation, rules that ensured he remained untouchable, were meaningless here, rendered fragile and brittle by a woman who refused to bow, who refused to play by the conventional scripts of power and submission. For the first time, Damien did not deflect. He answered, the words catching in his throat before forming with surprising clarity, an honesty he had rarely allowed himself because her presence had begun to strip away the carefully constructed layers of armor he had worn for decades. Each moment of her curiosity and laughter, each subtle smile, each challenge began to dismantle the meticulous control he prided himself on, replacing it with something that was at once terrifying and exhilarating. Vulnerability. Every glance she threw, every question she asked, every small act of defiance was a key turning in the lock of his carefully maintained fortress of composure, a reminder that he was no longer entirely in command, and the realization both thrilled and unnerved him because he was a man accustomed to bending circumstances, manipulating outcomes, and ensuring obedience. Yet here, in the golden-shadowed halls of his own mansion, he found himself increasingly powerless to dictate the rhythm of events, increasingly vulnerable to the charm, wit, and quiet authority of Selina, whose spirit refused containment. He watched her pause by a grand piano, her fingertips lightly grazing the polished ivory keys, not to play but to feel, to engage, to assert her presence in a space that was meant to enforce his rules, and in that moment, Damien's chest tightened, a subtle, unbidden reaction, his pulse quickening with an intensity he had not felt in years, a mixture of desire, admiration, and the strange terror of realizing that control, for once, was slipping through his fingers like water. The mansion itself seemed to respond, every flicker of candlelight, every shadow along the walls amplifying the tension, the anticipation, the unspoken duel of wills that now defined their interactions, and even as he maintained a composed exterior, his mind raced, calculating, analyzing, unable to predict the next move, unable to impose the usual discipline that had guided him through countless business empires, negotiations, and personal encounters, because Selina operated on a level of autonomy and courage that defied precedent. That night, as a storm rumbled outside and rain tapped persistently against the windows, Selina's laughter echoed lightly down the corridors, a sound that struck Damien unexpectedly, drawing his gaze involuntarily, and in that laughter he sensed defiance, playfulness, and a challenge disguised as amusement, and he found himself leaning against a doorway, observing, silently debating whether to intervene, to assert control, or to simply watch as she continued to traverse the space on her own terms, each choice fraught with tension, because every moment she moved freely was a subtle erosion of his authority and an equally potent invitation to vulnerability. Their encounters grew more frequent, more layered with complexity, each passing hour revealing the sharp contrast between his meticulously controlled world and the chaos, spontaneity, and fearless autonomy she embodied, and with every conversation, every glance, every soft word exchanged across the mansion's expansive rooms, Damien felt a pull toward her that was increasingly impossible to resist, a magnetic attraction that tugged at the very core of his being, challenging him in ways that strategy, fear, or money never could, igniting a fire that both scared and exhilarated him, a fire he had long believed extinguished by experience and the walls he had built around himself. It was during one such evening, as the rain streaked the windows and the storm whispered its fury into the mansion's corners, that a subtle, almost accidental brush of her hand against his wrist in the hallway sent a jolt through him. Instantaneous and undeniable, a shockwave of sensation that made him freeze mid-step, heartbeat chaotic, breath-catching, and a realization dawning that the line between captor and captivated was not merely blurred, but dangerously dissolving with every passing second, with every minor interaction, with every seemingly innocent gesture. Selina, unaware of the magnitude of the effect she had just triggered, continued onward, her focus on some distant painting or the texture of the carpet, while Damien remained rooted in place, staring at the spot her hand had touched, mind swirling with conflicting emotions, the instinct to assert dominance, the impulse to pull her close, the undeniable attraction that made logic crumble, and the recognition that the rules he had lived by no longer applied, that each calculated step could no longer contain the emotional storm brewing within him. Mini cliffhangers unfolded constantly in these moments. The subtle sway of her hips as she moved past his field of vision, the tilt of her head that suggested thought beyond mere observation, the curve of her lips when she smiled at nothing in particular, each a signal, each a provocation, each an invisible test that he found himself compelled to fail, because every instinct screamed for control, even as every fiber of his being was drawn toward her freedom and audacity. Damien began to notice things he had long ignored in others. The way her dark eyes scanned, assessed, and registered minute details, the way she breathed calmly even when confronted by uncertainty, the way she commanded attention without effort, and the way her presence lingered in his mind even when she was absent, leaving a residue of fascination and desire that clashed violently with his need to dominate, to control, to dictate outcomes, a clash that made him restless, distracted, and achingly aware of the fragile hold he maintained over himself. Every hallway became a stage of silent confrontation, every room a battlefield of wills, every glance a subtle challenge, and Damien realized with increasing urgency that Selina was dismantling his control, not with force, not with threats, but with courage, intelligence, and presence alone. And that the man who had never allowed anyone in, who had spent decades constructing a perfect empire of fear and obedience, was now teetering on the precipice of fascination, obsession, and vulnerability, a precipice that he could neither step back from nor predict where it would lead. Hours blurred into nights as he observed her, followed her discreetly through the mansion, noting how she adapted, how she explored, how she questioned, all while never breaking her composure, and he caught himself imagining conversations that had not yet occurred, outcomes that might never materialize, and desires he had long thought dormant suddenly stirring with violent insistence, each one tethered to the undeniable realization that the woman he had kidnapped, the woman who should have inspired fear, had instead ignited something he had never allowed himself to feel, and the knowledge both exhilarated and terrified him, because the rules he had relied upon, the control he had wielded over his world, were proving futile in the face of her unshakable presence, and Damien, the man who had conquered empires and hearts alike, had never faced a challenge quite like Selina, a challenge that promised to upend not only his world, but the very foundation of his self-mastery, and he found himself strangely willing, perhaps even eager, to surrender in small, measured ways to the force she represented, a force that was as dangerous as it was intoxicating, as commanding as it was irresistible. And in that surrender, subtle though it might be, he sensed the beginning of something inevitable, something that neither rules, fear, nor decades of experience could contain, a beginning that would blur lines, ignite desires, and unravel control in ways he could not yet anticipate. A beginning that was whispered in the fleeting brush of hands, in the light of a gaze, in the quiet heartbeat of two people orbiting dangerously close to a collision that neither dared name, yet both could not resist. The storm outside pounded against the mansion windows with relentless fury, a symphony of thunder and lightning that seemed to echo the turmoil building inside Damien, a tempest that matched the chaos of his thoughts. The unpredictable pulse of desire that had been quietly smoldering for days, but now surged with a force he could no longer ignore. And even as he moved through the shadowed hallways of his estate, each step precise yet heavy with anticipation, he felt the magnetic pull towards Selina intensify, a force that bypassed reason, defied logic, and rendered the meticulous control he had cultivated over decades utterly powerless, because she had become more than an intruder into his home. She had become an intruder into his carefully guarded heart, a presence that challenged, provoked, and ignited him in ways no one else ever had, and with every heartbeat, every silent breath he took as he approached her room, the world outside, the storm, the city, even the mansion itself, faded into insignificance, leaving only the tension that crackled between them, invisible yet palpable, a line drawn in the air that neither dared to cross, but both felt compelled toward. Damien's hand hovered near the door, hesitating for the briefest fraction of a second before the instinct that had long been buried beneath layers of authority and control surged forward, compelling him to enter without permission, to close the distance between them in a move that was both reckless and irresistible. And as the door swung silently open under his touch, the scent of Selina washed over him, intoxicating, magnetic, impossible to ignore. A fragrance that was uniquely hers, yet somehow impossible to describe fully, a scent that spoke of warmth, danger, and temptation all at once, and it wrapped around him like a spell, forcing him to take another step and then another, until he was fully in the room, where shadows danced across the walls in the flickering light from the storm outside, and Selina stood there, tall, poised, and fully herself, her eyes locking with his in a gaze that was simultaneously challenging and tender, a gaze that unbalanced him in ways he could not begin to rationalize. She had been waiting, or perhaps she had not known he would come, but her presence commanded the space, her stance unyielding yet vulnerable, and every subtle movement of her body, the tilt of her head, the curve of her lips, the flash of curiosity in her dark eyes, became a magnetic force that drew him closer, inch by inch, each step measured yet inevitable, until the distance between them shrank to inches, charged with a tension that threatened to ignite at any moment. And Damien's breath hitched as his fingers trembled slightly, betraying the internal struggle he waged between reason and desire, between control and surrender, between the man who always commanded and the man who now found himself helpless before her presence. He tried to rationalize the intrusion, to cloak his actions in logic. Perhaps it was punishment, perhaps it was the assertion of authority, perhaps it was simply curiosity, but the truth was undeniable. Raw and undeniable. He was drawn to her, consumed by her, and every fiber of his being screamed for closeness, for touch, for the forbidden intimacy that hovered between them like an invisible flame, dangerous yet irresistible, and with every heartbeat, every stolen glance, the line between captor and captivated blurred further, a dangerous, thrilling dance that neither could name, yet both felt compelled to follow Selina, sensing the charged energy in the room, did not recoil. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, curiosity mingled with defiance, as though daring him to cross the unspoken boundary, as though inviting him into the storm he could no longer resist, and the subtle quiver in her voice when she whispered his name sent a jolt through him, reverberating through his chest into his core, igniting sensations he had long denied, making him lean closer, lowering his voice almost unconsciously to whisper hers, the sound a confession, an obsession, a claim wrapped in the silk of restraint that he could no longer maintain. Every inch of air between them vibrated with electric anticipation, every flicker of movement, every subtle shift of her weight, every glance from those dark, luminous eyes stoked the fire between them. A fire that neither sought initially, but which now raged with the intensity of the storm outside, mirrored in every tremor of his body, every pulse that surged in response to her presence, every thought that abandoned reason for sensation, and with each step closer, the world beyond that room, the rain, the mansion, even the thunder, fell away, leaving only the intimacy of the moment, the brush of their energy, and the promise of a collision that was as inevitable as it was forbidden. He moved with deliberate caution, aware of the danger of giving in completely, yet aware that each second spent apart was torture, each heartbeat spent in denial, a lie to the primal pull that had been building since the first night she had entered his world, since the first spark of defiance had ignited in her eyes, and every subtle interaction. The light touch of a finger, the faint breath of air between them, the tiny shifts in stance or glance became an exquisite torment, each one a cliffhanger in a silent story written in tension and longing, each one a step closer to the precipice where control would no longer exist. Selina's gaze flicked momentarily to the lightning flashing outside, the room illuminated in sudden brilliance and then plunged back into shadow, And in that instant, the proximity, the anticipation, the dangerous allure of their closeness reached a peak, as if the storm itself conspired to mirror the tempest in Damien's chest, and he found himself involuntarily leaning closer, drawn to her warmth, the magnetic pull of her scent, the subtle curve of her lips, and the unspoken promise that this moment, this charged, delicate, electric moment, could spiral into something neither had ever permitted themselves to feel. Their skin brushed lightly, innocent, accidental, yet loaded with intention, and the tremor in Damien's hand betrayed the control he desperately tried to maintain, a control that was unraveling with breathtaking speed. Each heartbeat, each breath, each microsecond charged with intensity, the tension unrelenting, the stakes impossibly high, as if the room itself had become a crucible where desire, obsession, and defiance melted into a single, irresistible force that neither could resist nor escape. A force that promised transformation, surrender, and the collapse of every rule he had lived by. Lightning split the sky again, stark and brilliant, illuminating every line of their faces, the heat of the room, the subtle rise of their chests, the rapid pulse of adrenaline and anticipation, and in that brief, brilliant flash, Damien realized the truth he could no longer deny. He no longer wanted to fight the pull, could no longer resist the flames of desire that Selina had ignited within him, and every instinct, every shred of his meticulous discipline surrendered in that instant to the intoxicating, dangerous, and utterly compelling woman who stood inches away, challenging him, tempting him, and drawing him into a fire from which there would be no retreat, no control, and no escape. Mini cliffhangers unfolded constantly, the flick of her eyelashes, the subtle quiver in her lips, the gentle inhale she took, the way her gaze shifted yet held him, the way every heartbeat seemed synchronized yet independent, the way her scent, her warmth, her very presence became a gravitational force, pulling him irreversibly closer, each detail a silent provocation, each movement a challenge, each breath a whispered dare, all while the storm raged outside, matching the relentless, consuming storm that now consumed Damien completely, leaving him aware of one undeniable truth. The line between restraint and surrender had vanished, replaced by a consuming fire that neither reason nor pride could contain. A fire that promised desire, obsession, and the dangerous thrill of two souls colliding in ways that would leave no part of either untouched, no control unchallenged, and no heart unclaimed. The rain hammered against the mansion's windows with an almost violent insistence, a steady, drumming symphony that mirrored the rapid beating of Damien's heart as he held Selina in the quiet after the storm had passed, both outside and within him, the world beyond the mansion dissolving into insignificance as the intensity of the night consumed every thought, every sensation, every breath, leaving only the heat of shared bodies, the intoxicating scent of her hair mingling with the faint trace of his cologne, and the silent acknowledgement of the collision that had shattered boundaries and rewritten rules he had long considered immutable. Damien's hands moved with an urgency tempered by a tenderness that surprised him, tracing lines along her back, memorizing the contours of strength and softness that coexisted in her, while Selina, despite the whirlwind that had swept them into an uncharted realm of desire, maintained the poise, the courage, and the defiance that had first drawn him in, wrapping her strength around his darkness in a way that seemed to dissolve the rigid walls of control he had spent a lifetime constructing. And with every fleeting brush of skin, every whispered sound of breath, every soft, shivering murmur, the storm inside him grew more ferocious, more uncontrollable, threatening to sweep away reason, ego, and everything he had held sacred about dominance, order, and restraint. The mansion itself seemed to fall silent, as if bearing witness to the intimacy that consumed them, the creaking of floorboards, the flicker of candlelight, the distant rumble of thunder outside, all fading into a muted background against the symphony of shared gasps, hurried heartbeats, and the subtle shifting of weight beneath them, each movement a testament to the surrender and assertion entwined in equal measure. Each glance charged with the unspoken acknowledgement of the power they held over one another, the delicate balance between yielding and claiming that now defined them. And Damien, who had spent decades mastering every interaction, now found himself caught in a web of sensations and emotions he neither anticipated nor could fully control. A web that Selina wove with the sheer force of her presence, her intelligence, her courage, and the magnetic pull that had grown with every passing hour. The night unfolded as a series of moments both fleeting and eternal, each second stretched into an eternity as Damien pressed closer, seeking, needing, and yet uncertain, driven by a desire that went beyond physical connection, a desire to understand, to feel, to merge the fractured parts of himself that Selina's presence had uncovered, and as her hands traced the lines of his shoulders, her fingers brushing through the tense muscles he had long conditioned to remain impenetrable, he felt barriers crumble, walls fall, and a vulnerability emerge that was as terrifying as it was exquisite, and each soft, daring look she offered him, each subtle shift of her body, became both a challenge and an invitation, a siren call he could not and would not resist. Damien's mind raced with conflicting impulses, the part of him that had orchestrated empires and manipulated lives, now powerless against the woman who had refused to bow, the woman who had shattered the lines between captor and captivated, and yet the part of him that sought connection, warmth, and something he had long denied himself surged, demanding attention, recognition, surrender, and as he traced the delicate plane of her jaw, the curve of her neck, the graceful arch of her back, he realized that the night had not merely been a collision of bodies, but a collision of souls, a reckoning of need, desire, and something far deeper, a recognition that in her he had discovered not weakness but unparalleled strength, not submission but partnership, not control but a force that commanded him to give in Selina, in turn, moved with a mastery of her own, guiding him, testing him, drawing boundaries even as she dissolved them, asserting her presence with a quiet confidence that forced him to meet her entirely, without deflection, without the usual shields, and in that dance of dominance and surrender, the line between passion and love began to blur, each touch carrying the weight of emotion neither had dared name, each stolen glance a promise of devotion, each whispered syllable a confession of vulnerability that left Damien breathless, heart racing, and utterly undone. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the room in jagged brilliance, casting fleeting shadows that danced across their bodies, highlighting every subtle tremor, every shiver, every shudder of pleasure and tension, while the rain's relentless drumming became a steady drumbeat to the rhythm of their union, a backdrop that heightened every sensation, every gasp, every unspoken vow that passed between them without a single word. And in that crucible of intimacy, Damien's rigid self-discipline, the armor that had protected him for decades, disintegrated, leaving only raw, unfiltered emotion. A man utterly captivated, irrevocably drawn, and entirely vulnerable to the woman who had refused to surrender. Hours slipped by, unnoticed, each moment layering upon the last, a crescendo of passion and intimacy that neither planned but both experienced with inevitability. And as dawn approached, filtering its soft, golden light through the heavy curtains, Damien found himself lying beside Selina, every muscle still humming with the echoes of the night, every breath a reminder of the connection they had forged, and every glance at her peaceful, sleeping face, the soft rise and fall of her chest, the stray strands of hair across her forehead, filled him with an overwhelming sense of awe, protection, and longing he had never allowed himself to feel before, a need so profound that it left him whispering into the quiet, unshared darkness of the room. "I can't let you go. Not now." Not ever. Many cliffhangers lingered in the morning light, the subtle twitch of her fingers in sleep, the slight movement of her eyelids as if sensing his presence even in dreams, the residual warmth of her body, the lingering scent that clung to the sheets, the storm outside fading, yet leaving a tension in the air, and the unspoken acknowledgement that their night had irrevocably altered everything, shattering barriers, rewriting rules, and binding them together in a way that neither time, reason, nor circumstance could undo, while the mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, the quiet rooms echoing with the memory of every touch, every whispered name, every heartbeat that had raced and stilled, a silent witness to the night that had transformed captor and captive into something dangerously, irrevocably intertwined. Damien's hands lingered over her form, tracing lines, memorizing her presence, and yet he dared not move too soon, for even in his desire, he recognized the fragile balance of trust, the subtle power she wielded in allowing him close, the immense responsibility that came with the intimacy they had shared, and as the soft morning light continued to paint the room in muted golds and shadows, he remained awake, watchful, entranced, and entirely aware that the night had not merely been a passage of passion, but a turning point, a defining moment in which the lessons he had sought to teach had been inverted, rewritten, and forever entwined with the strength, courage, and indomitable spirit of the woman who now held his heart, his desire, and, in ways he could scarcely comprehend, his very soul. The first light of dawn filtered softly through the heavy curtains, illuminating the quiet mansion where Damien remained by Selina's side, watching her sleep with a mixture of awe and possessive longing, the events of the previous night still pulsing through every fibre of his being, leaving him raw, unguarded, and yet enthralled by the intoxicating mixture of surrender and strength she had displayed. And though he had believed himself immune to distraction, to vulnerability, to being truly undone by another person, Selina had achieved it effortlessly, and the realization both thrilled and unsettled him, for in her presence, every carefully constructed part of his identity, the ruthless billionaire, the master of control, the untouchable man who had ruled over empires and fear alike, was rendered irrelevant, replaced instead by a desperate desire to protect, to cherish, and to claim her entirely, to ensure that nothing in the world could ever harm the woman who had so effortlessly shattered the barriers around his heart. And even as he traced the line of her jaw with a fingertip, memorizing the soft curve of her cheek, the delicate arch of her brow, and the faintest tremor in her eyelashes, he recognized that his life had shifted irrevocably, that every future action, every calculated plan, every decision made within the walls of his empire would now be colored by her presence, by her needs, by the invisible tether that bound them together with threads stronger than any business deal, stronger than any political maneuver, and far stronger than the fear that had once governed every interaction he had encountered. Days began to fall into a rhythm neither had anticipated, a pattern built not from planning, but from the magnetic force that drew them into shared spaces, secret corners, whispered conversations, and fleeting touches that were laden with meaning far beyond their simplicity, and Damien found himself oscillating between the roles he had always inhabited, protector, ruler, manipulator, and a new role entirely, lover, companion, someone utterly captivated and completely vulnerable, and yet he carried it all with the same intensity, the same focus, the same meticulous attention to detail that had made him feared in boardrooms and on city streets, though now those skills were applied to understanding Selina, reading her moods, anticipating her movements, ensuring her comfort, and protecting her in ways that no one outside the mansion could even imagine, for she had become the axis around which his world now rotated, and he was entirely powerless to resist the gravitational pull of her presence. Selina, in turn, adapted to this strange, intense rhythm with a cautious grace, stepping lightly into the world Damien had created, observing, probing, and understanding it without surrendering herself entirely. maintaining her strength even as her heart began to bend toward the man whose darkness was offset only by the intensity of his devotion, whose complexity was matched by the vulnerability he had revealed in his rare, unguarded moments, and whose love, when glimpsed in fleeting touches, in stolen glances, in moments of quiet intimacy, felt like sunlight breaking through shadows she had never thought she would willingly inhabit. A warmth both unfamiliar and irresistible. A force that beckoned her to trust, to hope, to imagine a life entwined with a man who could both terrify and enthrall her with equal intensity. The mansion, silent witness to their private world, became a theater of subtle dramas, each room echoing with laughter, whispered arguments, and the tension of two souls learning to coexist within impossible circumstances, a tension heightened by the constant knowledge that the outside world, the empire, the enemies, the obligations, the shadows that loomed over Damien's life, continued to exist, pressing against the fragile sanctuary they had built together, reminding them that the peace they found here was temporary, fragile, and to be cherished fiercely, and every knock on the door, every unexpected message, every faint sound from the halls beyond their private chambers became a potential threat, a mini cliffhanger that kept their senses sharpened, their awareness acute, and their bond even tighter as they navigated both the intimacy of the present and the uncertainties of the future. Damien's gaze lingered on Selina as she moved through the mansion with quiet authority, small gestures betraying a comfort in the space, yet revealing her ever-present vigilance, the way she paused by the windows, the tilt of her head as she considered the rain, the soft hum of thought that escaped her lips even when unspoken. All a reminder that while she was a woman who had surrendered nothing willingly, she had chosen, in countless subtle ways, to share pieces of herself with him, and with every shared glance, every soft word, every gentle touch, he felt the invisible walls of his heart giving way further, the armor he had relied upon cracking, his meticulously maintained control dissolving beneath the steady, irresistible weight of affection, desire, and emerging love. They spoke in whispers during their clandestine moments, conversations that danced between teasing and confession, curiosity and revelation, questions that exposed vulnerabilities he had hidden for decades and insights she had never shared with anyone. Each interaction layered with unspoken tension, each pause pregnant with possibility, and every near touch, accidental or deliberate. A spark that sent electricity surging through both of them, leaving them breathless. Their minds and bodies attuned to each other in ways neither had anticipated. A constant mini cliffhanger that held their attention, sharpened their instincts, and deepened the intimacy that grew with every shared moment. Damien found himself unexpectedly distracted during his usual routines, the Empire demanding attention, yet fading in importance as he thought of Selina, wondered if she was safe, imagined her laughter echoing through empty halls, pictured her expression when she discovered something new within the mansion, and felt the magnetic pull of her presence even when she was not there. A pull that both delighted and unnerved him, for it reminded him that he was no longer the master of every circumstance, no longer entirely in control, and that the life he had meticulously planned had shifted its axis around a woman who defied prediction, who demanded respect, who commanded attention without effort, and who had captured his heart entirely without asking. The tension between them was heightened by small challenges, playful disagreements, and whispered debates that often ended in laughter or lingering gazes, mini cliffhangers built into their routines. A hand lingering too long on a doorknob, a brush of clothing against skin in passing, a glance that held more meaning than words could convey, a pause before responding to a question, each moment fraught with anticipation, desire, and the slow, intoxicating pull of intimacy that neither could resist, yet neither dared fully name, each one a reminder that their bond, though forged quickly, was deep, potent, and transformative. Yet despite the intimacy, Damien's world outside the mansion, the empire, the obligations, the dangers, the enemies, remained ever present, reminding him that their moments were temporary, precious, and precarious. And each time Selina crossed a hallway, moved through a room, or laughed softly at some quiet observation, it was as if the world held its breath. A mini cliffhanger suspended in time, a delicate balance of vulnerability, connection, and the potential for disruption, and Damien felt the weight of it all pressing on him, even as he savored every second, every smile, every stolen touch. Then, one evening, as the golden light of sunset filtered through the grand windows, painting the room in muted warmth, Selina froze mid-step, her face paling visibly, her hand instinctively clutching her stomach, a whisper escaping her lips that trembled with disbelief and fear. "No, this can't be real." And in that instant, Damien felt a jolt of urgency unlike anything he had experienced, the world narrowing to the fragile figure before him, her eyes wide with shock, the soft flush of panic rising in her cheeks, and every instinct screaming that everything, every decision, every moment they had shared, had reached a tipping point, a turning moment whose consequences neither could yet fully grasp, a moment pregnant with suspense, uncertainty, and the undeniable realization that their lives, already irreversibly intertwined, were about to change in ways far beyond desire, passion, or even love. And the mansion, silent witness to their bond, seemed to hold its breath with them, every shadow, every flicker of light, every sound of the wind or distant rain, carrying the weight of anticipation for what would come next. A cliffhanger that promised upheaval, revelation, and the next chapter of a story that neither of them could yet imagine, but which would define the course of both their worlds in profound, irrevocable ways. The moment Selina whispered the words that would shatter and reshape Damien's world, a silence unlike any he had known descended over the mansion, thick and almost tangible, as though the very walls held their breath alongside him. And for the first time in decades, the man who had mastered fear, power, and control found himself utterly unarmed against the force of emotion that surged through his chest. For Selina's hand pressed to her stomach was a declaration, a revelation that carried a weight he could neither manipulate nor dismiss. And as her eyes met his, unwavering yet trembling, he felt every carefully maintained barrier of self-discipline crumble, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and entirely consumed by the realization that life, his life, her life, the life growing between them, had suddenly taken on a gravity far greater than any empire, any wealth, or any power he had ever claimed, and he stood there frozen, heart hammering, mind racing, the storm of fear, pride, and longing colliding in ways that left him breathless, desperate, and entirely unprepared for the love that now demanded everything of him, a love he had never sought but could no longer deny Damien's hands, which had so often orchestrated empires, negotiated deals, and enforced obedience, now hovered near her, trembling slightly despite the effort to maintain composure, the temptation to cradle her, to hold the source of this revelation, irresistible and overwhelming, and each passing second stretched unbearably, every tick of the clock amplified in his ears as he processed the enormity of what she had said, the depth of what it meant, and the responsibilities that now bound them irrevocably together. And in the quiet of the mansion, with only the faint whisper of the storm outside and the distant city hum for company, Damien felt the walls of control he had built over decades collapse entirely under the weight of his emotions, leaving him raw, desperate, and painfully aware of his need for her and for the life she carried. Selina, sensing the storm within him, did not flinch. Instead, she held his gaze, steady and resolute, her hand still pressed to her stomach, a symbol of trust, courage, and the unspoken understanding that she was not asking him to protect her in the conventional sense, but rather to stay present, to remain beside her, to love her fiercely without the need for domination. And the simplicity of her request struck him with more force than any command he had ever given or received, unraveling the layers of ego, fear, and authority he had relied upon for so long, leaving him teetering on the edge of an emotional precipice that he both feared and longed to dive into. Every thought Damien had cultivated about control, power, and identity seemed suddenly irrelevant, as if the empire he had so painstakingly constructed was nothing compared to the fragile, potent reality of a life forming within Selena. And as he struggled to find words, he realized that speech alone could not convey the tumult, the awe, the consuming intensity of love and responsibility he now felt. And so he remained silent for a heartbeat longer, simply observing, memorizing, and absorbing every detail of her expression. The slight tremor of her lips, the faint sheen in her eyes, the way her chest rose and fell with restrained breath, the subtle tilt of her head as if preparing herself for the storm of his reaction. Each detail a silent confession, each movement a pulse of life and courage, and each second spent watching her made the gravity of the moment even more profound. We're going to be parents," he finally whispered, his voice breaking in ways that startled him, the syllables trembling not from weakness but from the depth of feeling that had been unleashed. A combination of awe, fear, protectiveness, and a longing so visceral it left him hollow and full at the same time, and Selena's steady yet quivering nod confirmed the truth he had both feared and hoped for, a truth that transformed every plan, every expectation, every thought about the future into something entirely new, fragile, yet impossibly strong. And in that instant, Damien understood that nothing in the world would matter more than keeping her safe, nurturing the life she carried, and remaining entirely present in a way he had never imagined possible. For the magnitude of love he felt eclipsed every ambition, every desire for power, leaving him consumed by a singular, all-encompassing devotion. Many cliffhangers built themselves into the room, the soft flutter of her eyelashes as she blinked against the emotional intensity, the subtle quiver of her fingers as she clutched the hem of her nightgown, the faint rise and fall of her chest under his unwavering gaze, the distant rumble of thunder outside, as if the city itself mirrored the storm raging in his heart. The subtle creak of the floorboards that reminded him of the world beyond their private space, and the soft, almost imperceptible sound of her whispered breath. Each element a fragment of tension that kept him grounded yet on edge, fully aware that this revelation was just the beginning, that their lives, already tangled, were about to shift in ways that neither could fully anticipate, but which would demand every ounce of love, courage, and resilience they possessed. Damien's fingers itched to move, to cradle her, to place a hand over the new life she carried, yet he restrained himself, mindful of her strength and the silent trust she had placed in him, the invisible line between protectiveness and overreach that he dared not cross. And as he stood there, heart hammering, chest tight, eyes fixed on her trembling form, he realized that the very foundations of his identity, ruthless, calculating, untouchable, were being rewritten in real time by the simple truth of her pregnancy, by the reality of their impending parenthood, by the profound and terrifying power of love that demanded surrender, not strategy and devotion, not control. Every instinct within him, every skill he had honed over decades to manipulate, to dominate, to conquer, now collided with the unyielding force of vulnerability, responsibility, and desire. And the combination left him simultaneously exhilarated and paralyzed, unable to fully articulate the torrent of emotions raging within, yet incapable of stepping away, for every fiber of his being screamed to remain, to cherish, to protect, to love with a ferocity that defied reason. And as the seconds stretched into minutes, Damien felt the weight of his own silence pressing, a mini cliffhanger that held both him and Selena suspended in the moment, a delicate balance between revelation, reaction, and the unknown consequences that loomed over the next steps of their entwined lives. Selena, sensing the storm within him, extended her hand slowly, brushing the side of his face with a tenderness that belied the tremor in her own heart. And in that simple gesture, Damien found a lifeline, a bridge between the overwhelming surge of emotion and the clarity that love required. And as he closed his eyes briefly, letting the intensity wash over him, the world outside the mansion, the city, the empire, the threats, the past, all faded into irrelevance, leaving only the quiet, fragile, and potent reality of the life they were about to create, the bond they had forged through passion, tension, and shared vulnerability, and the unspoken yet undeniable promise that he would never allow harm to come to her or the child, that every decision, every heartbeat, every breath would be dedicated to ensuring their safety, their happiness, and the irrevocable connection that now defined their existence. As night fell again over the city, the mansion silent except for the subtle sound of their breathing and the distant hum of life beyond the walls, Damien whispered into the darkness, his voice low, raw, and unwavering. "No one will ever hurt her. Not now. Not ever." The words carrying both a promise and a threat, a declaration of love and protection, a statement that the empire he had built, the power he had wielded, and the ruthlessness he had relied upon were now all subordinate to the life growing within Selena and the woman who had completely captured his heart, leaving the night charged with anticipation, devotion, and the undeniable certainty that everything in their world had changed irrevocably, and that nothing, no threat, no enemy, no circumstance could ever undo the bond that had been forged in fire, passion, and love. Many cliffhangers lingered. Her soft shiver as she pressed closer to him, the subtle catch in her breath, the faint tremor of excitement and fear mixed together, the distant echo of city life that reminded them both the world awaited them, and the silent question of how their lives, already so tightly intertwined, would navigate the perils and challenges that were sure to follow. Each uncertainty, a thread of suspense that held them tightly, intimately, and irreversibly together, their hearts beating in a rhythm that was both fragile and unbreakable. A rhythm that would carry them forward into a future neither could yet fully comprehend, but which promised love, devotion, and the protective fire of a man utterly consumed by the woman he adored and the life she now carried within her. The revelation of Selena's pregnancy had not been confined to the walls of the mansion or the private corners of Damien's empire. It spread like wildfire, moving faster than the richest deals or whispered threats that usually dominated the city, carried in murmurs through Damien's boardrooms, whispered by those who had once obeyed out of fear and now watched with trepidation as the man who had ruled with an iron fist shifted entirely before their eyes, reshaped by love, by vulnerability, and by a responsibility that dwarfed even the most formidable power he had ever wielded, and Damien felt it all pressing on him, the eyes of friend and foe alike, the unspoken expectations and the silent judgments. Yet none of it could reach him here, within the sanctuary of the mansion, where Selena moved through the space with a quiet grace that demanded attention, that commanded respect, yet exuded softness, warmth, and a strength he could never have anticipated. And every glance she offered, every gentle touch, every whispered question or fleeting smile became a lifeline, a tether grounding him to a reality that was entirely different from the one he had built, a reality that replaced fear with devotion, ruthlessness with tenderness, and domination with unwavering protective love. He watched her from the doorway of the grand living hall as she traced her fingers along the edges of the furniture, adjusting cushions, smoothing the drapes, her hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. And the faint curve of her lips in quiet amusement or contemplation struck him with an ache that was both thrilling and terrifying, because he realized just how deeply his life, his heart, and his very being were entwined with hers, how the empire, the wealth, and the fear he had relied upon for decades now seemed hollow in comparison to the gravity of the bond they shared. And yet, as the golden light of sunset filtered through the ornate windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors, Damien felt the tension in the air, the subtle undercurrent of unease that had been threading itself through the mansion ever since the news of Selena's pregnancy had begun to circulate. a warning pulse that danger was closer than they could see, that the world outside, with all its threats, rivalries, and ambitions, had not disappeared, and that every moment of peace they savored within these walls was both precious and precarious. Many cliffhangers unfolded in each shadow, the faint rustle of leaves outside the courtyard, the distant hum of an unfamiliar engine, the subtle shift of the curtains in the hall where the wind carried whispers of something approaching, each sound a reminder that the life they were building together was fragile, that the protective bubble they had managed to construct could be breached in an instant, and that Damien, for all his power, would have to fight harder than ever to shield Selena and the child growing within her, to ensure that their love would not be destroyed by the machinations of those who saw opportunity in vulnerability and weakness. Damien moved to Selena's side, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, his touch firm yet protective, grounding them both. And as their fingers entwined, the reassurance in his grip conveyed a message that words could not fully capture, that he was here, that he was hers, and that no threat, no enemy, no scheme could sever the bond that had grown between them, a bond forged in fire, passion, defiance, and unwavering devotion, a bond that had transformed both of them and which now defined the center of their universe, making everything else fade into insignificance. Selena, feeling the weight of his gaze and the protective intensity of his presence, leaned slightly into him, her head resting against his shoulder, the faint curve of a smile touching her lips despite the undercurrent of tension, and Damien's heart tightened, the mixture of relief, love, and fear coiling within him, because he knew that their happiness, as profound as it felt in this moment, was only temporary unless he acted, only sustainable if he anticipated, planned, and fought for it with every ounce of power, strategy, and determination he possessed, a realization that both exhilarated and burdened him, and yet, as he drew her closer, inhaling the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her body, and listening to the steady beat of her heart, he knew with unwavering certainty that no obstacle could diminish the depth of the love he felt, that he would never again allow fear or pride to distance them, and that he would confront whatever challenges lay ahead with the same intensity and focus that had made him a ruler, now tempered by the vulnerability of devotion. The hours passed with a rhythm of intimacy, conversation, and quiet laughter, the mansion alive with the subtle hum of two lives converging in harmony, yet the underlying tension never fully dissipated, each glance at a locked door, each distant sound beyond the walls, each unexpected creak of the floorboards carrying with it the possibility of intrusion, the potential for conflict. And Damien's mind never strayed far from the dual mission of protecting Selena and preparing for the new life that was already shaping their future, and every whispered word between them became a silent affirmation, a promise that they were united, that no external force could sever their connection, and that whatever trials awaited, they would face them together, with love as their shield and their guide. Then, as night fell, heavy and thick with the promise of storms, both literal and metaphorical, the subtle, almost imperceptible sound of a knock at the mansion gates broke the silence, reverberating through the halls. And in that instant, Damien's senses sharpened, his body tensing instinctively, every muscle coiled like a predator ready to strike, because this was no ordinary interruption, no friendly visitor arriving with congratulations, no familiar face bringing comfort, no herald of a mundane obligation. This knock, deliberate, resonant, and unnerving, carried with it the weight of confrontation, of danger, of a challenge that threatened to dismantle everything he had built and everything he now cherished. And the unspoken knowledge of what it could mean pressed upon him like a physical force, forcing him to move with precise, silent speed, gathering Selena close, shielding her with the breadth of his frame, his mind already racing through scenarios, contingencies, and strategies to protect her, And yet, even as he did so, a thrill ran through him, the intoxicating blend of fear, power, and desire to conquer whatever threat dared touch the woman he loved, and the life they would nurture together. And every step toward the door carried with it a mini cliffhanger, each heartbeat a reminder that the world outside was unpredictable, ruthless, and waiting for the slightest weakness to exploit. Damien paused at the threshold, hand on the ornate doorknob, and glanced back at Selina, whose expression was a mixture of trust, fear, and anticipation, the soft glow of candlelight dancing across her features, illuminating the fierce determination that had first drawn him to her, the same determination that had sparked every moment of passion, intimacy, and vulnerability they had shared. And in that moment, he felt a surge of protective fury, of love that demanded immediate action, and a certainty that no power on earth could deter him from defending the life and love that had become the center of his existence. And as the door creaked open, revealing shadows that promised conflict, intrigue, and challenge, Damien's lips pressed briefly to Selina's forehead, a silent vow passing between them, unspoken but absolute. Nothing would harm her. Nothing would threaten their child, and their love would endure beyond any scheme, beyond any enemy, beyond the world itself, and the very air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of that promise, the tension of the unknown, and the unstoppable force of a love that could, quite literally, destroy worlds. Mini cliffhangers pulsed with every detail, the rustle of garments in the hallway, the shifting shadow just beyond the gate, the faint echo of footsteps, the distant rumble of thunder, the subtle tightening of Selina's grip on his hand, Damien's own steadying breath, the quiet creak of floorboards as he advanced, and the electric anticipation of confrontation that promised both danger and the ultimate affirmation of their unbreakable bond, each element heightening the suspense while affirming the depth, intensity, and unshakable devotion that now defined the core of their intertwined lives, leading to a climactic crescendo where love, passion, and power converged in an irrevocable, triumphant declaration that no one, no force, and no world could ever separate Damien from Selina and the life they were destined to protect together. Wow, what a journey! I hope you felt every twist, every emotion, and every heartbeat of the story. Now I want to hear from you. How much did you love it? Rate the story out of 10 in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Beyond Color Stories, because there's so much more drama, love, and suspense coming your way. Thank you for staying till the end. And remember, every story here has a world waiting for you. See you in the next one.